Hello, ECED 2360 students. I hope everyone had a great last couple of weeks. I know we had a lot of content to cover, but this is going to be our second part when we're talking about implementing inclusive early childhood programs. So you just finished with embedding opportunities for that child based on their goals throughout your schedule throughout the day. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how do we manage challenging behaviors with our case study child. So students sometimes will have challenging behaviors. We all have that. But if these behaviors become persistent or they link to a disability or they impede social or academic success, they're going to require intervention. Okay, so in module 6, you're going to be introduced to the different types of behaviors, right? We're going to be looking at development for that child, right, in your classroom and how they acquire social skills and then we're also going to look at the social development of the child. Um, there's a Center for Social Emotional Learning called CSFO, and there's a video in section 6.1 that really talks about how you, as an educator in early childhood, can support social development, as well as like those things like executive functions and self regulation, which are really important for students to be successful, not only academically, but socially. So, then in the second lesson of 6.2 is where we're going to really look at what are FBAs, which is called a functional behavioral assessment. And then how do we create a behavior intervention plan? Okay. And again, we're going to go back to that Center for Social Emotional Learning, and they created what we call a tiered model. And that helps us support and prevent challenging behaviors. So those are going to be like the main focus for our module 6. And you're going to see here, I've always list the module objectives of what you should be able to do and then the outcomes for a course that it supports. Okay, so we're going to look at how do you define social skills and explain their importance in the development of children with disabilities in early childhood. We're going to recognize executive function skills and the critical period for their development. List the common triggers in the educational setting that may impact children with significant scores or ACEs scores, which you will be learning about. And then we're going to learn how to use a functional behavioral assessment and that whole process to help us develop an intervention plan. So these are really our module objectives that are going to help meet our course outcomes. I did give you some guiding questions to kind of help you when you're reading your chapters and studying during the module. So, in the chapters, you have 3 chapters in the textbook Exceptional Child. You're going to read the Developmental Behavior Approach, Chapter 12, Chapter 15, Facilitating Social Development, and then Chapter 18, Managing Challenging Behaviors. I did list some additional resources for you. Always, if they're additional and you can't get time to read it, save this information. I feel like it's a good resource for you as an early childhood educator. So we have resources that come from the Harvard University. Actually, it's talking about the developing child, specifically executive function and self-regulation. So look at that. And then also there is a video on pyramid model for social emotional development. So I thought that was really cool and wanted to share that with you. Here's your vocabulary that you will be seeing throughout the text chapters as well as our modules, lessons 1 and 2. So as always, you have 2 weeks to complete the 2 weeks to complete both lessons and read your chapters. So again, as I mentioned, 6.1 is important because we start looking at early childhood development, the social emotional skills, um, executive function, also, what I was mentioned to you about the CSE Phil, I call it CS Phil, but it's really that center on social emotional foundations. Really, their work focuses on that development, the social emotional development for children, young children specifically. And so this talks a little bit about it. Their website is there. Um, and there is other resource video strategies that give you practice strategies when you want to teach this to children, which is important. So just keep that in mind as well. So that's what we talk about when I say CSFL. those strategies. There's also executive functions, and then there is activities that you can practice in lesson 6.1. And what I did is I went ahead and broke it up to different age groups because I in some of us are working in early childhood centers or sites. I don't know what age you teach. So I thought it'd be good to go ahead and you look at the one age level that you're teaching or maybe that you're interested in when you get out of school. So they're linked here for you as well. So that takes care of lesson 6.1. Let's look at lesson 6.2. Lesson 6.2 is really good. There, first, I want you to watch the behavior management video that I put up. This is me. I want you to really watch that video before you begin the second lesson. And then we really dive deep into behavior, right? We look at what a PBS is and a SWPBS when we're talking about in needs of a child that is younger in early childhood. We define what challenging behavior is. There's the pyramid model there for you. Again, the CS field one I talked about. And really, what I want to take a second and talk to you about with this model is you can see here that this is called a model for supporting social emotional competence. And this is in young children and infants. So, really, the intensive interventions, if you look at this pyramid, are really at the top, right? Um, and when we're talking about intensive intervention, this is for persistent challenging behaviors, right? And those children are not responding to the typical guidance that we'd provide them. And it doesn't mean that this is just something that will go away. This is something that would have to be intervened. So you'd have that intensive intervention. And those who may be on the line there, you have your targeted social emotional supports. Um, this is just like structured approach to teaching those social skills, right? Um, and then you have your high quality supportive environment, nurturing and positive environment, and then that makes an effective workforce. So this model just gives you good indication of what it is when we're trying to look at social emotional behaviors. And then we talk about positive behavior supports or school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. And this is something that you'll see a lot in schools, the school-wide. But for younger children, we really look at positive behavior support. And remember, it's there to so we can change a child's behavior. Okay, so look at that section as well. And then in 6.2 as well, we're going to look at start defining what a functional behavior assessment is, right? What does it mean? When we're looking at functional behavior, we are trying to change that behavior. It's challenging, but remember, behavior communicates something. They're either trying to gain something or avoid something. So they're communicating to us, but challenging behavior is hard because sometimes we're not getting the message, right? Children that are young don't have the language skills to communicate the proper way with you. So this means it results in challenging behavior. So this illustrate here, this chart is really illustrating you the primary function. So remember, function is how the behavior works, right? So what is causing them to do this. So, this is really what you're going to try to look at. When we say that child's trying to obtain or avoid, um, it's really going to be about these three categories, right? Internal or sensory, meaning that sometimes this is seen in children who have autism or other disabilities. So, it could be sensory input to sound, visual, or touch. Either they want to avoid it or revive it more intensely. Then you have social, which is often attention or interaction. Some kind of child wants to avoid from an adult or a peer or to obtain something from adult or peer. And then next is the tangible activity. Um, this helps the child avoid completing their work or participate in activity, or they want to obtain some assistance with a task and they don't do it independently, right? But before you can determine the function of a behavior, you really have to collect data. So that way we can make a guess or a hypothesis of what function it is and how we can support it. Okay, so that's beginning to talk about that functional behavioral assessment. And I talk about what the ABC model is, and we explain it a little bit deeper in this video. So please make sure that you watch my other video. And then we look at how we gather information with that data. So there's one of the data you're going to learn about is what we call an ABC. It's called an antecedent behavior consequence analysis. And it's really to determine the pattern and what the triggers are, right? So antecedents is known as a trigger. Um, then you have B for your behavior, and then C is the consequence. What happens immediately following that behavior? Okay. ABC analysis are useful because we are able to develop a hypothesis or summary of the statement to that challenging behavior. Okay, there is a video here that will open up. This kind of talks you through an overview of collecting the information. So there's two types of data, okay? ABC is known as direct data. Then you have indirect data, which is not mentioned here, but it would be like antecedent behavior notes, interviewing a parent, sending questions home about behavior. So that would be more like your indirect, but we're concentrating on direct behavior to gather some data to help that child. And then that will help you obviously develop a hypothesis statement. I do have some examples here. So please make sure you look at that. We have to have a hypothesis statement. It's critical in developing an intervention plan. It's linked directly to the function of that child's behavior that's challenging. So make sure that you check this section out. And then lastly, we are going to look at the behavior intervention plan. So, how do we support them? And this is actually going to be part of your homework. So, make sure you pay close attention to this. I also did put a PowerPoint. This came from CSFIL, and this is going to show you different examples of prevention and replacement strategies. So this here it gives you a visual of a behavior intervention plan, which is what a team put together. So it will list Tim's behavior, which is going to be verbal aggression, threats, physical aggression. He hits or pushes, kicks or punches. Um, his function is to obtain a toy or play. So here's the trigger. If Tim is in a group and he's in centers in a group or he's outside playing with his peers, this is the trigger. This is what causes him to display this verbal aggression or physical aggression. So these are two things that he does. Two types of things that he two types of behavior that you can measure. Now remember, and if we're taking data on a child and we're using data gathering with this ABC chart and we came up with a hypothesis, this would be our last step. This would be our intervention plan, right? So, how are we going to fix Tim's problem? They say their hypothesis or the function of the behavior is that he wants to obtain the toys and play with his friends. However, he wants it for himself. This is an issue. There's with this that's where that verbal aggression or physical aggression is coming in. Then you have to list what happens when this behavior is occurring. Okay, so this is everything you're gonna usually when you do a intervention plan, it's going to be laid out in this type of chart. Sometimes it may look a little different, but this is give you an average of what we would do. The top section here is explain everything that's going on right now in your high function of the behavior, your hypothesis of why you think he's doing it, right? And then what happens every time this behaviors are displayed? Well, the peers, if they get hit, they'll just give him the toy. They give it up. I don't want it. Leave me alone. You're not being my friend right now. Or they'll leave because they don't want to be around that. Or adults will intervene with negative attention, which means he gets punished or something happens to him, right? So it's negative attention, which is what we don't want. So we have to come up with some new skills so we can prevent these triggers from happening. So new skills would be asking to play, teaching Tim to ask others to play with the toy instead of him just taking it or hitting them to get it. Also teaching him how that everyone can play with toys. So you can do this in a whole group setting where you talk about and show them and model how we ask friends to play, how we join play. Um, and then teaching Tim to ask the teacher for help so he can be involved with the play. So, how do we do that? When we teach these new skills, we got to say, how are we going to prevent this from happening? So, what are we going to use with these new skills we're applying? How are we applying the new skills? Well, we're going to teach these skills by role playing, maybe using social stories or visual cards, um, and then helping him learn how to self monitor. So, starting a self monitoring form when we're working on new skills. And then we have to put what we're going to do. How are we going to respond? Okay. So the consequences will either cause the behavior to keep happening or it will prevent the behavior. So, what you have to realize is that sometimes Tim might have slips. If he's not responding and he reverts back to his challenging behavior, how are you going to deal with it? And again, it needs to be different than what you did up here because what you were doing here was not working. So, you have to make sure that you put, if he does hit or threatens verbal aggression, these are the things that we're going to do. We're going to cue him, anticipate the cues um, for our new skills, remind him of our new skills, and intervene to help support him, right? And we're going to give attention to the child that this is happening to, not to Tim, okay? We're going to remind him, but we're also going to intervene to prevent harm from the other children or the other little people in the classroom. And then we have to do, whenever Tim's doing the great things that we're teaching him, how are we going to respond? Right? What are you going to do? Acknowledge him, give him positive behavior, certificate. We're going to celebrate that he's doing better, right? So that's what we would put there. Okay. Now, for your activities and assessments, you have two things you're going to do. Well, excuse me, three things. You have actually four things. Sorry. You've got your quiz, your Module 6 quiz, and then you also have a discussion. Okay, so the quiz will be open for 2 weeks. Okay, so you'll have a while to do it. And then you have your discussion activity. So this discussion activity is going to be talking about that social emotional development, specifically the fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, so there's a video. Um, so the first link is going to take you to the actual discussion, but you're going to watch a video that says this is the effects on stress on a child's development. And then I also included a PowerPoint that talks about understanding and responding to adverse childhood experiences. So what I want you to do is I want you to watch the video, I want you to look at the PowerPoint. Okay, and what you're going to do inside the PowerPoint, I want you to look specifically at slide 11. And what you're going to do is you're going to look at that slide that talks about common triggers for traumatized children. There's 7 triggers listed. I want you to choose one of those 7 triggers. And then I want you to look at the 3 responses that children may experience when they experience trauma, right? So these 3 things are their responses to any kind of trigger for fight, flight, or freeze. They're going to choose one of these. What you have to do is you're going to identify a strategy for each of these responses, right? So you're going to pick one of the 7 triggers and then you're going to respond how the child will respond. So what would be a strategy you can use? And then when you're done, you will obviously write your reflection. Okay, so there is a link to the form. This is just an example that explains it. Okay, so first on slide 11, you pick your trigger. What are the possible child responses? So, what would fight look like for this trigger? What would fight look like? What would freeze look like? And then I want you to list a possible strategy of how you would react to support that child, right? So, in fight, how would you support them? What strategy could you use for that response? What strategy could you use for a child that's in flight? And what strategy can you use to help a child who's in freeze? And then I want you to react. Think about your own classrooms that you have um, or your experience and practice of teaching. If you had any experience with children who have experienced trauma, right? Um, how will you develop your classroom where you make sure the possibility of triggers are not occurring, right? So what are the preventative measures could you take to avoid the trigger um, in the child in your classroom? So that will be your discussion. So you have your quiz and I went over your discussion. The next one you're going to do is the behavior plan as well. And so the behavior plan you're going to see here is going back to what you learned about functional behavior assessment, where you have to collect data. right? And we need to look at um, ABC forms, coming up with the hypothesis of the function, like what's the function of the behavior, and then an intervention plan. So, what you're going to do is you're going to look at your case study child and you're going to look at one of the challenging behaviors. Now, Clayton, let's say you have Clayton. If I click on Clayton, there's going to be a separate document that opens. Okay, we have two behavior concerns on Clayton, and it gives you behavior concerns and it talks a little bit more about them. Okay, I want you to pick only one of those behavior concerns for your case study child. Let me go back to where I was at. Sorry. And then after you pick, after you pick that, you're going to complete a behavior support plan. Okay, so I'm going to open it up and show you what it looks like. Okay, this is what I was talking to you about in lesson 6.2. You're going to put the name of your case study child here. You're going to put the behavior concern, like what are the behaviors are doing. Think about the antecedent or the trigger, okay? And use module 6.2 to help you. Use your textbook chapters. So you're going to list the trigger and antecedent from that behavior concern that you picked with your case study child. And then what happens is maintaining the consequence. So what happens when that child displays the behavior? Then, once you have all the information, you're going to list what the hypothesis of the function is. So, what do you think is happening? Are they obtaining something, avoiding? Why are they doing that behavior? So, specifically state the hypothesis. Then, you're going to come up with some new skills for your case study child. Okay, and then how are you going to put these into effect to make sure they prevent those skills up there or those behaviors from happening? And again, how are you going to respond if that child revert back to the old behavior, or how are you going to respond when that child is displaying the new skills that you're teaching them? Okay, so that will be your homework. Um, the last thing that you're going to do is you're going to look at a lesson plan. Okay, so I put two sections here. This is the actual lesson instructions for the lesson. The one underneath, I'll show you in a minute, is going to be the lesson that you're going to adapt. Okay. Now, I am going to give you extra time on Module 7. Uh, I want you to start it now. Even though it says Module 5, I know it's confusing. I want you to start it now because you will be turning it in Module 7, but I wanted to take a minute and go over it. That's why I put it in Module 6 because it's going to take a little bit of time. Okay, that's for concentrating on the discussion and the behavior, but I wanted to get you started with Module 7 Adapted Lesson Plan. So, what I want you to do is going back in the class, let's go back here. Underneath this document, you're going to see lesson plan. You're going to use the lesson plan and adapt it. Okay, so you will choose one of the two lesson plans for your case study child, and then you're going to make modifications and adaptations to the plan. So you'll see here, you pick one lesson. So I would look at both of them and see which one you want to modify. Okay, so this will be your case study child. You're only choosing one. So let's go back to the instructions and I'll kind of walk you through it. So what you're going to do is download the lesson plan so you'll have it. And what I want you to do is you're going to make some adaptations. Now, whenever you are adapting a lesson plan, you have to realize that there are different components in it that we're looking at that might be better suited to make adaptations. You have to first look at the objective, okay? Um, so you can add an individual objective for the child based on their goals if you want, but the objective that is there in the lesson plan that's for the entire class cannot be changed. So you could add something, but you can't change the objective, okay? And remember, you have to really look at the lesson plan to see kind of what you think you could add to it. The standard cannot be changed. It's either going to be a Tennessee standard or an ELDS, or it's going to be a K3 standard. Okay. Then you have materials and preparation, and then you have your format, like how it's going to be taught in a large group, small group, or individual. Again, that's going to be depending on your lesson you choose. And then what are the lesson procedures, and then how will that child be assessed to know that they met that objective? Okay. So one thing I want to know is when you're adding modifications or make sure that you make it where I can see where you made modifications. So maybe you want to underline it or put yours in a different color or italicize it. Do something and make notes on the lesson plan too. That way I know that these are your notes and it's not part of the original plan. I want to know, and it needs to stand out the modifications, okay? Now, when you are providing an explanation about why you made those modifications or accommodations, that's going to be at the bottom of the lesson plan form, okay? And then you are going to realize that when you are making adaptations for lessons, which you will have to do sometimes, you need to choose the least intrusive, means that we always look at environment first, right? And if that's not going to help, then we look at changes in the activity or the routine. Can we change that? Or do we need to adapt different materials? Or do we make modifications on how we're going to present the material? And then lastly, that's where you would physically assist the child. Okay, so always think about the adaptations on a continuum. The goal is always to do the least intrusive, but you will move up and down throughout. That's why it's called a continuum. So this is to give you visual of what we're talking about. Okay. These elements are going back to our inclusive fieldwork assignment. You're going to see when you start, some of us already got the green light and you're beginning your 12 hours. The assignment looks at access, participation, support. This is connected to that. Okay. Once you complete the lesson plan, it's worth 25 points because it is a case study project. Um, it will be um, put into the Dropbox. And again, I'm extending the due date from this because you will submit this during Module 7, but I want you to begin working on it because it may take some time. Okay, I did provide a checklist right here for the assignment that kind of helps keep you on track of what I'm expecting for it, as well as the grading rubric that will help you get a better idea how you're going to be graded. Okay. All right. That's it for you. I hope you guys have a great 2 weeks, and just reach out if you have any questions. I do want to take a moment before I jump off here to remind you about your field work. You have 12 hours. Um, Field work and doing your 12 hours is just one piece of the inclusive field work. You also are going to be doing some written parts. So you will complete a QIPC checklist, and all this is inside of your inclusive practices fieldwork um, document. And I did have a guideline and checklist here for you as well. Um, and this was mostly for getting your materials ready so you can begin your 12 hours and get the green light. But you have to make sure you had your background check and submit proof. It has to be within the last year it's been done. You have to purchase liability insurance and upload proof to the assignment Dropbox. And then once I have those two things, I will email you a confirmation form. And remember, this has to be filled out by the site director um, uh, and the mentor teacher, like wherever you're going to be assigned to that school. You have to make sure that you have them complete it, saying they're okay with you being in that site. Now, if you have a school, like I am allowing you to do your hours at your school only in the case that you have multiple age groups. Okay, so if you work with infant and child and you have a 3-year-old room and you're not in a 3-year-old room or 4-year-old room, you could go observe and do your hours in that room. But you cannot complete your 12 hours in your own classroom. You cannot get paid for field work. Okay, so keep that in mind because I've had some questions about that. But at this point, you should have already given me your background check and liability insurance. I have emailed everyone. There's a few people that I've reached out directly to. So get back in touch with me because I do want to remind you if you do not complete the field work, you cannot pass this class. Okay. And many of us need this for our program so we can graduate early childhood program. So please make sure you reach out if you have questions. But again, that additional written piece I was talking about was this, where you will conduct an observation using the qualitative inclusive practices checklist, the QIPC. You will complete a teacher interview, focus on inclusive practices. You're going to do a written reflection and analysis, based on your observation interview, and then you're going to complete an advocacy letter. And all that will be one document. So make sure you read everything. The inclusive practices fieldwork assignment is here. So make sure that you are looking at the entire document. It is quite long. That's why I talked about this the very first of the semester. And I'll be honest with you, we have like literally 6 weeks left. We don't have much time. So you need to get on this and get this done and get your 12 hours in. Okay. But always reach out if you have questions. All right. Until next time, take care.